The alarm cut through my sentence before I even finished it, and every cadet in that room went still at the same moment I did. I am Daniel Cole, and I was in the middle of telling 300 cadets about a siege I had survived a long time ago, when the deck under our feet gave a hard, sudden shudder, like something enormous had struck the outer hull. The lights dropped to a dim red, and a calm, mechanical voice began repeating the same warning over and over. Hull breach detected. Sector 4. All personnel move to secure zones. Nobody moved. That is the strange thing about young officers who have only ever trained in simulations. Their bodies freeze for a heartbeat because some part of them still believes the alarm is part of the lesson. It was not part of the lesson. I felt the pressure change in my ears before the second alarm even sounded, and that told me everything I needed to know. Something outside had punched a hole clean through the station's outer ring, and the air in that section was already being pulled out into open space. I had felt that exact sensation once before, decades ago, on a station that no longer exists, and my body remembered it faster than my mind could. I did not have time to be afraid. Fear is a thing you deal with later, in the quiet, after everyone is safe. Right then, I only had time to move. I raised my voice, not shouting, just loud enough to cut through the confusion. "Everyone up," I said. "Leave your bags. Leave your notes. Follow me now, and stay together." A young woman near the front, a cadet named Grace Miller, was the first to react. She stood up so fast her chair fell backward, and she looked at me with wide eyes, waiting for direction, rather than giving in to panic. That single reaction told me she would be useful in the next few minutes, and I filed that thought away without slowing down. We are an academy station, orbiting a moon with no atmosphere of its own, which means every wall around us is the only thing keeping us alive. A hole in the wrong place is not a small problem, it is the only problem that matters. I led the group out of the lecture hall and into the corridor, where the emergency lighting painted everything in deep red and long shadows. The corridor was already filling with other cadets pouring out of nearby classrooms, and for a moment it looked like the whole floor might turn into a crowd with no direction, which is exactly the kind of moment that gets people hurt. I stepped into the middle of the corridor and lifted both hands. "Slow down," I said. "Nobody is dying today because we panicked in a hallway. Move in twos. Follow the green floor lights. They lead to the reinforced core. Go now." It worked because my voice did not shake. I have learned, over many uncomfortable years, that people copy the calm of whoever is standing closest to danger. If I sounded steady, 300 young officers would borrow that steadiness from me, at least long enough to get moving in the right direction. As we moved, a second impact hit somewhere above us, and dust rained down from a ceiling panel. A cadet near me, a young man named Peter Hale, stumbled and caught himself against the wall. His breathing had gone fast and shallow, the kind of breathing that leads to poor decisions. I put a hand on his shoulder without breaking stride. "Look at me," I said. "Not at the ceiling. At me. Walk. You are doing fine." He nodded, and his breathing slowed just enough to keep him moving properly. That is a small thing, but small things are what save lives in the first 60 seconds of any disaster. Nobody remembers the speech afterward. They remember that someone looked at them and treated them like they could still function, and so they did. We reached a junction where the corridor split 3 ways, and here is where the real trouble began. The signage above the middle path, the one leading straight to the reinforced core, had gone dark, its power cut by whatever damage had already spread through the station's systems. 2 paths remained lit, but only one led anywhere useful, and I did not have a working map to check which one it was. A station engineer came running from the opposite direction, out of breath, her uniform torn at one sleeve. Her name tag read Sophie Adler, and she looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has just done the math on how bad things really are. "The core access on the left is sealed," she said. "Automatic lockdown. The debris took out 2 support struts near the reactor housing, and the system thinks a full collapse is coming in that section." "How long?" I asked. She looked at a small device on her wrist. "Maybe 10 minutes before it decides to seal off the whole quadrant to protect the reactor. If we are still in there when it locks, we stay in there. 10 minutes. I had lived through worse odds than 10 minutes, but never with 300 people who had spent their entire lives believing danger was something that only happened in textbooks. I turned to the group behind me. "New plan," I said. "We go right, toward the secondary shelter near the training bay. It is farther, but it is not sitting under a damaged reactor housing. Move quickly, but do not run. Running causes falls, and falls cause delays." We moved. The corridor narrowed here, forcing us into a slower line, and I found myself near the back with Sophie the engineer, watching the group stretch out ahead of us like a long ribbon of red-lit shapes. Halfway down that narrow stretch, the deck plating buckled slightly under a cadet's foot, and I heard a short cry followed by a heavier thud. I pushed forward through the line and found a young man on the ground, his leg twisted at an angle that told me immediately he would not be walking on his own. His name, I would learn later, was Nathan Ward. He was pale, gripping the edge of a bent floor panel, trying very hard not to make a sound that would slow anyone else down. "Do not apologize," I told him, because I could already see the apology forming on his face. "This is not your fault. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when a station takes damage. We deal with it. We do not waste time feeling sorry about it." I crouched and checked his leg quickly, the way I had been trained to check a wounded teammate a very long time ago, in a place with far less light and far worse odds. It was not broken in a way that threatened his life, but it was broken enough that he could not carry his own weight. "Sophie," I said, "we need something to carry him on." She looked around and spotted a long equipment locker built into the wall, meant for emergency tools. Inside it was a rigid stretcher panel, the kind every station is required to keep near high-traffic corridors. We pulled it free together, and I helped ease Nathan onto it while 2 other cadets, seeing what we needed, stepped in to help lift. "This is the part I want every one of you to remember," I said to the cadets nearby, my voice raised just enough to carry. "History is not the version of events where nobody gets hurt. History is the version where someone gets hurt and the people around them decide right then not to leave them behind. That decision is the whole lesson. Everything else is just details." We kept moving, 4 cadets carrying Nathan between them, and I noticed something interesting happening in the group as we went. The fear on their faces had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It had become useful fear, the kind that sharpens attention instead of freezing it. Grace Miller had taken charge of the smaller group ahead of us, keeping them tight together and checking behind her every few seconds to make sure nobody had fallen out of the line. Peter Hale, the young man who had been struggling to breathe earlier, was now helping an even younger cadet who had begun to cry quietly, speaking to her in a low, steady voice that reminded me of the voice I had used on him only minutes before. That is how it spreads. Calm is not something one person gives to everyone else. It is something one person gives to the person nearest them, who then gives it to the next person, until an entire crowd of frightened young officers starts behaving like a team, instead of 300 separate points of panic. We reached another junction, and this time the lights above both paths were working, which should have been good news. It was not, because a thick cloud of gray smoke was rolling out of the left corridor, thin enough to see through but thick enough to make breathing difficult. Sophie coughed and covered her mouth with her torn sleeve. "Coolant line," she said. "That path runs too close to the reactor's secondary systems. We cannot go that way." That left only the right corridor, which I did not recognize from the station's public layout. I turned to Sophie. "Where does this lead?" "Maintenance shaft," she said. "It connects to the training bay eventually, but it was not built for large groups. It is narrow, and there is a service ladder about halfway through. A service ladder, with 300 cadets, one of them unable to walk, and smoke closing in behind us. This was the exact kind of moment that used to end badly, decades ago, in a place I try not to think about too often. The difference this time was that I had learned something from that old failure, and I intended to use it. "Listen carefully," I said to the group. "We are going through a narrow shaft. That means we go in a strict order. Smallest and quickest cadets first, so the path stays clear. Strongest cadets carry Nathan through the middle. I will go last, with anyone who needs extra time. Nobody stops to wait for friends. Waiting in a smoke-filled corridor helps nobody. Moving quickly helps everyone, including the people behind you." There was no argument. That surprised me a little, even after everything. 300 young people, trained mostly on simulations and lecture halls, organized themselves into a moving line within seconds, because somewhere in the last 10 minutes, they had learned to trust the structure I was giving them. The shaft was tight, exactly as Sophie had warned, forcing cadets to move almost sideways in places. The service ladder appeared exactly where she said it would, a long vertical drop with rungs bolted into the wall, leading down to a lower corridor that connected to the training bay. Lowering an injured cadet down a ladder is not something you do quickly, and every second we spent on that ladder was a second closer to the 10-minute mark Sophie had mentioned earlier. I positioned myself below Nathan's stretcher as 2 cadets above lowered him carefully, guiding the panel so it would not catch on the ladder's edges. Halfway through this careful process, the station shuddered again, harder this time, and a distant groan of metal echoed up through the shaft from somewhere below us. Sophie's device on her wrist beeped sharply. "Reactor housing has shifted," she said, her voice tighter now. "We might be looking at 5 minutes, not 10. 5 minutes was not a comfortable number, but it was still a number, and numbers can be worked with. I called up to the cadets still waiting their turn on the ladder. Move faster, but keep your grip solid. A fall down this shaft is worse than a few extra seconds of smoke. We finished lowering Nathan, and the line kept flowing down the ladder, cadet after cadet, controlled and quick. I stayed near the top until the last few cadets had gone. Then I climbed down myself, feeling every one of my years in my knees by the time I reached the bottom. The lower corridor opened into a wider space, and ahead of us I could see the reinforced doors of the training bay, already standing open, with station staff waving cadets through into the safety of its thick walls. We were almost there when the corridor lights flickered once, then died completely, plunging us into a darkness broken only by the faint emergency strips along the floor. Somewhere behind us, deep in the station's structure, something gave way with a long, low sound that I felt through the soles of my boots more than I heard with my ears. "Move," I said, and this time I did shout, because shouting was the correct choice for that exact half-second. Everyone through the doors, now. The last group surged forward, and I found myself pushing gently at the shoulders of anyone still hesitating, guiding them through the reinforced doorway. Grace Miller was already inside, counting heads as cadets passed her, calling out numbers to make sure nobody had been left behind in the dark corridor. I was the last one through, and the moment my boots crossed the threshold, the heavy doors sealed themselves behind me, with a sound like a held breath finally being released. Emergency lights flickered on inside the training bay, dimmer than usual but steady, and for the first time since the alarm had sounded, nobody was moving. 300 cadets stood in that wide space, breathing hard, some crying quietly, most simply staring at each other, as if trying to confirm that they were all still real and still standing. Grace finished her count and looked at me, her face pale but steady. "All accounted for," she said. "Everyone made it." I let myself feel that sentence for exactly 1 second before setting it aside, because there was still work to do. Nathan Ward needed proper medical attention for his leg, and Sophie had already moved to a wall panel, working quickly to check the status of the reactor housing through the training bay's emergency systems. "It held," she said after a moment, relief loosening her shoulders. "The support struts failed, but the automatic seals did their job. We lost that section of corridor, but the reactor is stable." I nodded, and only then did I allow myself to sit down on a nearby bench, my legs finally admitting how tired they were. Cadets began settling around the space in small groups, some helping tend to minor scrapes and bruises, others simply sitting close together, needing the comfort of nearness after everything that had happened. Peter Hale approached me carefully, still slightly out of breath. "Professor Cole," he said, "how did you know all of that? The order to move in twos, the choice of corridor, all of it. It was like you had done this before." I looked at him for a moment before answering, because the honest answer mattered more than a quick one. "I have done this before," I said. "A long time ago, on a station much like this one, though far less lucky. Back then, we did not have a strict order for moving through danger. We panicked, and people got separated in a shaft very similar to the one we just climbed down. Not everyone made it out that day." The room had gone quiet around us, cadets nearby listening without pretending not to. "Today was different," I continued, "because I remembered exactly which mistake to avoid. That is the entire purpose of history. The real purpose, not the version you memorize for an exam. History exists so that the next group of people does not have to make the same mistake twice. Today, none of you had to pay for a lesson that I already paid for a long time ago." Grace Miller, sitting nearby with her arms wrapped around her knees, spoke quietly. "Is that why you always tell us the small details in your lectures? Not just what happened, but exactly how it felt?" "Yes," I said. "Because the small details are the only part that actually saves lives later. The dates and numbers are useful for exams. The feeling of smoke closing off a corridor, the sound metal makes right before it gives way, the importance of a calm voice when someone near you is afraid, those things only transfer from person to person if someone bothers to describe them honestly." Sophie the engineer, still working quietly at her panel, spoke without turning around. "Rescue and repair teams are inbound. External damage is being sealed as we speak. We will be able to return to the main sections within the hour." A quiet murmur of relief passed through the training bay, and slowly, cautiously, the tension in the room began to ease into something closer to ordinary exhaustion. Nathan Ward, propped comfortably against a folded blanket someone had found for him, managed a small tired smile toward the group of cadets who had carried him through the shaft. I sat there for a while longer, watching 300 young officers slowly return to themselves, no longer frozen cadets from a lecture hall but something closer to a group of people who had faced real danger together and come out the other side intact. That transformation cannot be taught from a podium. It can only be lived, and I was grateful. In a quiet and private way, that this particular lesson had not cost anyone their life. Later, once repair crews confirmed the corridors were safe again, we walked back through the same path we had escaped through, now brightly lit and swarming with engineers securing loose panels and checking structural supports. The narrow shaft looked smaller in full light, almost ordinary, nothing like the dark and smoke-filled passage it had been less than 2 hours earlier. As we reached the lecture hall once more, chairs still scattered from the sudden evacuation, Grace Miller lingered near the doorway while the others filed in ahead of her. "Professor Cole," she said, "today felt like the lecture come to life, not the words, the actual feeling of it." I gave her a small nod. "That is exactly right," I said. "Every cadet in this academy studies history because someday you may need to survive it, not just recite it. Today, you did both at once, and you did it well." She smiled, tired but proud, and walked into the hall to rejoin her classmates. I stood there a moment longer in the doorway, looking at the room full of young officers settling back into their seats. Quieter now, more thoughtful, no longer treating the old stories as distant and safe. They understood now, in a way no lecture could have given them, that history is never something that only happened to other people a long time ago. It is something that can knock on your own door at any moment, and the only real question is whether you have learned enough from those who came before you to answer that knock with steady hands. I walked back to the podium, gathered my scattered notes, and looked out at the room. "Shall we continue where we left off?" I asked. And this time, when 300 cadets leaned forward to listen, I knew they were hearing every word differently than they had just 2 hours before.